Thank you very much for having me here today. It's really a pleasure to be at BYU and to address you this evening and talk about some of these issues. It's also very nice to be introduced by Tom Mule, who is my boss for 15 years at the University of Wisconsin, pretty much. And so it's just a real pleasure to reconnect with Tom. So thanks for that too. We've been hearing all day and yesterday from some incredible collection of scholars around the issues of environmental ethics and the sense of stewardship and how it connects to sustainability. I've learned a lot today and from yesterday, especially from folks who are talking about from the ethical and humanist perspective, and also from the kind of the side from different faith-based perspectives in religion, which is something as a natural scientist is something I usually don't think about very much. And when I kind of go home to my core discipline, it isn't actually environmental science. Actually, I started off as an astronomer as an undergraduate. So you never know, students in the audience, you never know where you're going to end up, okay? So when I think about sustainability and I think about these challenges we face in the environment, I kind of go back to my inner astronomy student. And I think about these issues as a planet and saying, wait a minute, what's the biggest fact about this planet? The biggest fact about this planet is us right now. It's human domination of this planet. There's no other way to say that. We are the single biggest fact on the biosphere. And that's a relatively new phenomenon if you think about human history writ large. Go back and think about any definition of human history you want. 10,000 years since the founding of Jericho and modern cities that we see today, of modern civilization and the dawn of agriculture. Or you could go back 200,000 years to kind of modern Homo sapiens, people who look just like us walking the planet. Or if you really wanted to, go back 3 to 5 million years of hominid evolution. For almost any definition you want, almost all of human history was basically one interesting thing. It was that the Earth was essentially infinite and we humans were very, very small, okay? But that suddenly changed. That changed very recently where we became suddenly very big and the planet now looks quite small by comparison. Now, it's not that the planet actually got smaller, or anything like that. Don't worry about that. We've got enough problems. The planet isn't actually shrinking under our feet. But what happened is humanity just got a lot bigger all of a sudden. One of the reasons, of course, is just our sheer numbers in population. If we go back, through the Pleistocene into the modern era, we see that humans were very small numbers of organisms on the planet, maybe a few hundred million. Oops, slide went backwards. Oh, don't do that. Don't do that. Don't do that. We were, very small numbers of mammals running around the planet, just a few hundred million. And here we are today with, 7 billion. And almost all that growth happened very, very recently in the later half of the second millennium. And most of it really since about World War II. So here we are now at 7 billion people as of 2011, and we're going to add a couple billion more before we stabilize our population. So that fact alone shows you an incredible spurt of human growth of just numbers in a very recent blink of an eye of Earth history. But that's only part of the story. The other part of the story is this, is that not only are we more numerous, we're more clever. We have developed all sorts of interesting technologies to exploit resources, to make ourselves more comfortable, more proficient in transforming the planet. And this picture is a picture of what Earth looks like at night from outer space. It's a picture of our nighttime lights. It shows kind of the use of energy, the transformation of the surface of the world into an urban environment. We are now an urban species. About 50% of the planet now lives in cities. You can make out, there's no national boundaries here, but you can see India, you can see Japan, you can't see North Korea, for example. So some pretty interesting things in this map. But what we find is whether you look at human population and our technological prowess and our exploitation of resources, this moment in history suddenly looks very, very interesting because it's the moment of the great acceleration. Especially if you look at the period between 1960 and 2010, just the last 50 years, a very short amount of time. During just that 50-year period, the human population more than doubled. The economy, even including the current recession, grew by 7-fold, adjusted for inflation of purchasing parity dollars. Our use of resources increased for food 3 times, water 3 times, and energy 4-fold. in terms of fossil fuel-based energy. In other words, what happened here is that in the last 50 years, human activity more than outpaced all previous generations combined. Okay? This is incredible. We are living in a time that's changing more rapidly than all previous history, not just any previous history, all previous history combined in a single generation. That's an incredible moment to be alive. It's essentially an inflection point in our history as a species. And so how do we navigate that inflection point? That's probably the biggest challenge for sustainability. We have no historical analogs. History cannot teach us much about this great acceleration. Well, let's think about that moment. How's the inflection point working out? Well, on the whole, many things actually are getting better. Environmental folks really do need to remind ourselves to say this. You know, we can argue about how full or empty the glass is, but actually a lot of the glass is half full or better. We live in a more just society than any previous generations. There's more equity, more knowledge, more education, better human welfare than any other time in history. It's far from perfect. We have a lot of work to do. But I would put any other time in history against ours and say, do you think people were really better off back then? And the answer, I think, objectively would be no, they probably weren't. So the human condition is probably better than it's ever been overall. Far from perfect. But the human condition is not bad. But, and this is the big but of the environmental conundrum, we're better off, but maybe the environment is not. Essentially, that's because we're running out of planet. This explosion of humanity, in terms of just our numbers, our technology, our economic prowess, our use of resources, has moved us from being a species that could exploit resources on a local scale. We might use up this piece of land and then move on. We're now using up basically a planet now, if not more than a planet. And this is manifest in lots of different ways. For example, our use of land. This is a rainforest that was just burned down in the eastern Amazon in the state of Pará in Brazil, near the city of Belém, near the mouth of the Amazon and the Tocantins rivers. This is a rainforest that was burned down and is being turned into cattle pasture. So some cattle will be here. Very low densities. We're basically trading a rainforest for a very small amount of beef in this picture. Well, if that were just a local problem, you say, well, that's a shame. But when you look at the larger scale, maybe stepping back and looking from outer space, we can look at maybe larger patterns of our use of land resources. So here's a part of the Amazon now down in Bolivia, and we're looking here in 1975. And that green field you see is basically a virgin rainforest. It's primary primeval forest that hasn't really been touched very much. But if you look very carefully, there's a thin white line here, a road, and a little clearing out here in this kind of virgin rainforest. And it's the 70s. It's some guy out there with bell bottoms and listening to Bee Gees albums, ranching out in the middle of the jungle, basically, all by himself. Let's go back to the same place a few years later in 2003. Exactly the same place, same scale, no tricks here. This is a picture that looks basically like Iowa. And not only did the forest get cleared, the economy and the governance and the connection to the world was fundamentally changed too. Because you know what they're growing here mostly? Soybeans. You know where those soybeans are going? China. You know who for? The new Chinese middle class who wants to eat pork chops more. So Brazilian rainforests are turning into pig feed in China to feed a new middle class. If I had predicted that in 1975, you would have thought I was a lunatic. But look how much the world had changed in that period of time. Not just the forest, but the entire global economy and how connected we are across the world changed too. And this is, again, not just a local phenomenon. You could say, well, you picked one place in the world that was changing that much. Oh yeah? Well, let's look at the whole enchilada. This is the entire planet's land use, and it turns out to first order, the amount of land in the world is primarily used for one thing, growing food. All of the green areas, and this is work out of my lab at Minnesota, by the way, but I'll be referring to other people's work along the way here. But what we're showing here is in the green, and this is a map of the world's cropland, the amount of land we use to grow wheat and rice and corn and soybeans and strawberries and cassava and whatever we all eat. That whole area of the world is about 16 million square kilometers of land, which is bigger than all of South America, to put that in perspective. We have a South America's worth of land and some change devoted just to growing crops. The brown areas in the world are the largest ecosystem on the planet, pasture and rangeland. That's about 34 million square kilometers of land, a little bit bigger than Africa. So you have a South America's worth of land growing crops, about an Africa's worth of land growing animals. You put that together, just the food on the planet has cleared 40% of the Earth's land surface. Cities, by comparison, is a little less than 1%. So while cities are hugely important ecosystems and parts of our land use system, they're relatively small, concentrated pieces of real estate at the global scale, but they're very, very important. Agriculture, though, is very pervasive and covers much of the world's surface. And if we think about a question I'll be getting to later, if we're going to feed a couple billion more people, where's that land going to come from? The tundra and boreal forest, the deserts, or the rainforest? Because that's the only thing left. So we've cleared 40% of the Earth's surface already, and mostly for food. And food's going to have to increase. We also have used an enormous amount of water. This is a picture I love. It's actually a picture taken flying into Phoenix, which, coming from Minnesota, I find just really utterly bizarre, that Phoenix would be growing iceberg lettuce in the desert. That's what that is. And they're irrigating this iceberg lettuce and probably then turning around and selling it to people in Minnesota at our stores, which is crazy, given that the water for this came from here, from the Colorado River. Here's a picture of the Colorado near the Grand Canyon in the 1950s on a typical average day of flow. And here it is today. Now, there's lots of reasons for this, but the primary reason for the drawdown of this part of the Colorado is that, well, we're using that water for, oops, that would have been fun. Reminder, that's the stage. Okay, that this is essentially water that's been disappearing because the water is being consumed for irrigation. In fact, many of you know the Colorado no longer reaches the ocean most years, that it dries up completely in its riverbanks, and most of that's consumed for water for irrigating crops and deserts, or for growing cities like Phoenix and Scottsdale and all the rest. So we have consumed one of North America's great rivers, doing things like growing iceberg lettuce in the desert and having golf courses in Scottsdale. That's crazy, but it's something we're doing. And this is not isolated to the United States. It's happening all over the world. Some of you know this story, but many of you don't. This is kind of the Grimm's fairy tale of water, is the Aral Sea. It's a cautionary tale. The Aral Sea here in this former Soviet Union, this is Kazakhstan up here and Uzbekistan down below. This is a sea that shouldn't be here because that's all desert. All the stuff you around there that looks like sand, guess what? It's sand. It's just like it looks. The only reason there's water here is that way over there to the east, there are mountains, and in those mountains it snows, and the snow melts and provides water through two rivers, one up here and another down here, that fills this basin of sand with water, forming a large inland sea. But starting actually in the 50s, but it really accelerated in the 70s, the Soviet Union actually dammed up these rivers way over here and used the water to irrigate the Kazakh desert to grow cotton, of all things, mainly for cash crop exports to bring foreign currency into the Soviet Union. But when you turn off the water supply to the Aral Sea, what do you think is going to happen? Well, here it is in 1973. Here it is about 24 months ago. Pretty extraordinary change. And where I live, all I have to tell a Minnesota audience is saying, let's pretend that that's your cabin right there on Lake Superior, and Lake Superior moved 250 miles away. How would you feel about that? Well, not very good. But it's not just the fishing and recreation. That's kind of not the point. This is a major environmental disaster. Imagine one of our Great Lakes disappearing. Imagine if we only had one. And imagine if this tied to human livelihoods, to the economy, to industry, to transport, and to even the environment itself. Weather patterns, climate patterns have fundamentally shifted here. The Soviet Union didn't exactly have a Sierra Club or an EPA. So what was ever dumped at the bottom of the Aral Sea can now be airborne. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence, not very good epidemiological evidence, of very high cancer rates in this part of the world, which might be linked to that. But this is an environmental disaster too. So between the Colorado River, the Aral Sea, or Lake Chad, or parts of the Agua Aquifer, we're seeing massive consumption of water. Sandra Postel, a kind of a water policy expert, would like to say that we have about maybe consuming 50% of what could be considered the renewable available freshwater resource of the planet. Obviously, we're consuming more than that here, and more than that in the Colorado Basin. And most of that, interestingly, again, turns out to be for food. 70% of water withdrawals and 90% of consumptive use, when you take water out of nature and it doesn't go back to the same watershed, is for one thing: irrigating food, irrigating crops. So here we are consuming a planet's worth of land resources, a major share of our planet's water resources, and interestingly, we're kind of consuming the atmosphere too. And I don't mean we're using it as a resource, that we're gobbling up all the oxygen or something. Don't worry about that. That part's fine. But we're using the atmosphere as a convenient dump. For centuries, and especially since the Industrial Revolution, we've been using this as a convenient place to store pollution, carbon dioxide in particular. So we burn down trees, or we burn coal or oil or natural gas. That CO2 has to go somewhere. And it doesn't go away, it goes into the troposphere, the lower part of our atmosphere. And that's not a very big place, it turns out. The lower atmosphere is only about 10 kilometers thick, or 6 miles. So, a short commute by Utah standards would be out here, and you're out of atmosphere pretty much. All of our weather, all of our oxygen, all of our water, all comes from that thin, thin, thin little layer. So yes, of course we can affect it. We look up into the sky and think that it's infinite, but it's not. It's an extremely thin layer. Al Gore liked to say, like on a regular globe, the atmosphere's thinner than the shellac you'd put on the globe. And that's about right. So we have an extraordinary resource here, but we've overexploited it. We've been dumping pollution into it. Let's make that a little more real. Let's say you drive to work and you drive 25 miles. The average American car in our current car fleet would consume 1 gallon of gasoline to do that. If you hold a gallon of gasoline, a milk jug full of gasoline, it weighs about 7 pounds, a little bit lighter than water, mostly made up of carbon and hydrogen atoms, but all of the weight, because of the different nuclei, most of the mass will be carbon, and a little bit of the mass will be hydrogen. So you get 7 pounds of carbon, basically, in a jug, and you pour it into your car, and you burned it. But when you burned it, you took 1 carbon atom from that stuff in the jug, and you added 2 more atoms of oxygen, CO2, right? That turns out that 7 pounds of carbon turns into 20 pounds of carbon dioxide gas. And it goes into the atmosphere, and it stays there on average about 110 years. So your commute to work released 20 pounds of pollution into the atmosphere for you, your children, your grandchildren, and beyond to deal with. Just driving to work today. That isn't away. That's a ticking time bomb. And so we see that we're kind of running out of atmosphere. This loading of our atmosphere of greenhouse gases that are significantly altering the climate already, and much more to come, mostly from burning fossil fuels. But interestingly, it turns out, you'll see a theme here, about 30% of our emissions come from agriculture. Not from what people think. It's not food miles or tractors or chemicals. None of that stuff really matters very much. It's mostly from deforestation, methane coming from cattle and rice fields, and something called nitrous oxide that comes from over-fertilized soils if they're a little bit wet. So that's where those emissions really come from. I'll talk about that more in a minute. The point here is that we're basically hitting major planetary limits as we've exploded onto the surface of the world. Land, water, even the atmosphere itself. We're basically not just hitting, peak oil or whatever. We're hitting peak planet, folks. We don't have any more to go to, and the available resources are getting smaller and smaller and harder to work around. So this is a major moment in our history. And this isn't just an environmental problem anymore. I think this is calling us, to call that an environmental problem is very short-term thinking. This is essentially a civilization problem. In the sense, do you want to have one anymore, right? I, for one, do. I kind of like civilization. Like Gandhi, I think it's a good idea. Civilization isn't bad. Let's see if we can keep that going. But for us to do that, we have to answer some very, very hard questions. Some of the hard questions will be, well, how will we power the world in an industrial civilization? We're not going to give it up, obviously. So how do we power a modern technological civilization with 2 billion more people on the way and 4 billion people already here who are suddenly joining us in a global middle class? How are you going to power that civilization without significantly disrupting our climate? That's a major question that we don't have a perfect answer to. Another big question, one that I want to talk about today that doesn't get as much attention is, how are we going to feed a growing world? Given that a lot of the things we're doing to the planet isn't just climate change, actually the biggest hammer we're hitting the planet with right now is agriculture. Then climate change comes alongside it a little bit later in the century. So how are we going to pull this off? How are we going to feed a rapidly growing world? Well, this actually has 3 big parts to it. One of them, of course, right now is, well, we don't do that very well today. In 2006 and maybe 2007, there were about roughly 700 million people in the world who are considered food insecure. That is, they didn't have the ability to secure on a regular basis nutrition and calories they needed for a healthy diet. So 700 million people, 2 and a little change United States. In 2008, that number, which had been going down for decades, pivoted up and shot up to 1 billion in about 1 year, in 2008. And since then, it's gone down a little bit, and it's now around 850 million. But in round numbers, we have 1 billion people in the world who cannot have food security, adequate nutrition on a regular daily basis. That's an economic problem, though. It's not an agronomic problem. We do grow enough food to feed everybody right now, but we have about 1 billion people who don't have enough income to afford this food. They may live under $1 a day. And as price of commodities spike up, they are no longer within the reach of gathering daily food. So that's a huge problem, but it's mainly an economic problem. But in the future, and not too distant future, we're going to have to figure out how to feed more people anyway, because even if we did have enough income all over the world, there just wouldn't be enough food anyway to meet the kinds of demands we're seeing. And so feeding today is an economic challenge. Feeding tomorrow is an economic and agricultural challenge, because we're seeing some big demands on the world food supply. One, the obvious one that everybody goes to first is, hey, somebody just invited 2 billion more people to dinner. We're 7 billion now, we're heading to at least 9 billion, and that's just demographic inertia. You can't stop that. There's no way to stop that. Most of that's committed fertility or committed reductions in mortality. Populations grow for 2 reasons: people having lots of kids and people who aren't dying anymore. Most of the population growth in India, for example, is due to the reductions in mortality. So short of widespread euthanasia, you can't do much about a lot of this growth. So we're committed to a lot of that. We might even go beyond it, maybe to 10 billion. That's the latest UN population forecast. So we've got a couple billion more people coming to dinner. I hope you all have some extra chairs and tables and stuff. Okay, get out all the card tables. We're going to need them all. But that's really not the big factor, it turns out. We like to point at that and say, oh, the population problem, that's what's going to drive food supply. Not really. This is. There are 4 billion people in the world right now, already here, that we can already go and visit, who are becoming rich. They're in China, Brazil, India, Russia, the BRIC countries, and Vietnam, Thailand, and other places. And as they've joined a global middle class, we've never had a global middle class before. All of human history had an infinitesimally small number of very rich people, and then everybody else. Now we actually have a global middle class, which is kind of cool, actually. But it's happening so suddenly, it's putting amazing pressure on our resource bases in ways we don't even understand, let alone can we accommodate. But we have 4 billion people who are looking at the West and saying, yeah, I want to eat like that too. We see this in China, even India. They're going away from their meat taboos, even with beef, to join kind of Western diets. Other countries. And right now, if you look for every year, the increase in food demand, about 1/3 of that is due to population growth. 2/3 of it comes from increasing affluence and people getting richer and eating more fats, more meats, more oils, more sugars, and so on. That isn't always a bad thing, but it's a big stress in the system. If you just extrapolate that, though, population growth and affluence, if we keep doing what we've been doing lately, which I'm not saying we will, but if we did, You would have to about double the world's food supply in terms of calories by 2050. David Tillman and IHS Global Insight and a whole bunch of organizations have all done forecasts of this, and they all get the same number. We're staring down the barrel of needing to double the world's food supply by 2050. Jason Clay likes to point out we'll have to grow more food in the next 38 years than we have in the last 8,000 combined. We're not ready for that. So we got to feed the world today. We'll have to double that by 2050, at least be on track for that. And then, oh yeah, that's the reason I'm interested. We got to make this actually sustainable, because it clearly is not today. We can't double the food supply by doubling the land area. There wouldn't be any land left. Not enough. We can't double it with more fertilizer, more phosphorus, et cetera. There's just no way to do that. And maybe we can talk about this later, but the GMOs and all these genetic advances, they're not working either. There's no significant additional calories to the world from GMO corn and soybeans and all that. Additional profits, yes, but additional calories to the bottom billion who are hungry, zero. So we have a big challenge here of feeding the world sustainably and doubling its throughput into the future. And guess what? We've got to do this at the same time, and we have 38 years to pull it off. This is probably the granddaddy of grand challenges that we're facing the environment right now. A number of us have worked really hard in the last couple of years trying to figure out, well, how could you even do this? If you wanted to have these two goals, a human welfare goal, let's make sure the world is food secure and the poor don't become hungry, a very important ethical goal, and to truly make the environment sustainable, another ethical goal. How do you do the two simultaneously? What strategies could you use to feed more people and reduce the harm to the environment? Simple math, more food, less harm. Got to do both. So, well, we've come up with some kind of broad guidelines for how we have to think about this. One of the things we have to do is get away from the current paradigm. Like in energy lately, conservatives like to yell, drill, baby, drill. Well, in agriculture, we've been having the refrain, grow, baby, grow, for the last 30 to 40 years, and it's not working. We have to think about a different paradigm than just grow more, grow more. That isn't working. We'll have to think about how to grow better, grow smarter, and more efficiently, and deliver more value with what we already have. But there are 5 steps we can think about. They're very tangible. First, we've really got to focus on deforestation. I would argue for, at least on the planetary scale, clearing virgin rainforest, huge stocks of carbon and biodiversity and the ability to regulate water quality and quantity and so on. The ecosystem services of that landscape are enormous, and we're trading these for agriculture. If we were doing this to feed a billion people who would otherwise be hungry, I would say fine, I'll help you, I'll get out the chainsaw too. But that's not what we're doing. What we're doing with most of this is we're feeding the middle classes of the world. In Brazil, most of the land that's been cleared for deforestation are for beef and then soybeans, which are then feeding beef or pigs. They're not feeding the poor, they're feeding pigs and cows. In Indonesia, most of the deforestation is for palm oil or timber. So we're trading forest for food security, we're trading forest for convenience and affluence. So this is an enormous amount of damage for ultimately fairly little benefit to human well-being in the big picture. We can make money doing this, but we're not going to make the world better doing this. So, I think we have to look very hard at this situation. Well, if we can't expand agriculture into rainforests to grow more food, we're going to have to figure out how to grow more food on the land we already have. Fortunately, there are lots of places we can do this. In the United States, Europe, Brazil, Argentina, other places, we have an incredibly advanced agricultural technology, which has a lot of problems, to be fair. But there are many places in the world that have excellent soils, excellent climatic regimes, places across Latin America, Africa, even Europe, Eastern Europe after the fall of the Soviet Union. The Soviet agriculture was a complete train wreck, and then it got worse when the Soviet Union collapsed. It's terrible. They're only getting about 20% of their potential productivity in key crops like barley, wheat, maize, and other important staple crops. We could quadruple the yields of Ukraine and Russia and Belarus and Poland like that if they adopted some fairly simple agricultural improvements. They don't require GMOs or all that kind of thing, just soil remedies. Also across Africa, we know what to do. And we could vastly improve the delivery of food and nutrition without much environmental harm along the way. And we know kind of where to look now. So this is some really important work. We also, though, have to not repeat the mistakes of the first green revolution, where we just said, hey, let's use all the water we need, all the nitrogen we need, all the phosphorus we need, just fertilize to death, water to death, without any regard to the environment. But, take a look at this. This is, irrigation equipment, pretty standard in the United States. Can you imagine a way that could waste water more than that? Seriously, I've asked my students, can you devise a machine that could waste water more if your goal is to drip it into the soil, into the roots? Plants don't get water from the air, they get it from their roots. Why do you put it there? So it turns out that we can be vastly more efficient. On average around the world, it takes about 1 liter of water for irrigation to make 1 food calorie. So even if you're a vegetarian, you're eating about 3,000 liters of water a day, or 800 gallons. So, a lot of my students get very upset about bottled water. I'm like, why? It's a plastic problem. But you know how much water it took to make this bottle of water? Exactly 1 bottle of water. It's the most efficient delivery vehicle for water on the planet. The plastic's a big problem. I don't like the plastic. The water part, meh, not a big deal. But if you, okay, this is BYU. I shouldn't ask this question, but I was going to say, if you had a coffee this morning, I forgot my audience for a second. But some of people who drink coffee, and if they had a Frappuccino this morning, that might have consumed about 300 gallons of water to make it, almost entirely in the cream. So, okay, you have, but other universities would never dream of banning coffee from their campus. But they're talking about banning bottled water. Like, I don't know, guys. Which one do you want? Are you talking about plastic? Or are you talking about water? Because we eat much more water than we could ever drink. But that 1 liter per calorie, and if you eat meat, add about 2 zeros to that number in terms of your daily water consumption if you eat meat, a lot of meat anyway. But it turns out the average is kind of misleading because the Israelis are about 10 times more efficient than the global average, and India and Pakistan are about 10 times less efficient than the global average. So between the Israelis and the Pakistanis, let's say, there's about 100-fold difference in efficiency. Israelis can produce 100 times more food with the same amount of water because they use drip irrigation instead. But in Pakistan and Rajasthan and northwestern India, they flood fields with enormous evaporative losses. So they're very inefficient, take 10 times more water to do that. So we have enormous, enormous opportunities to grow the same amount of food with maybe 10-fold improvements in nutrient losses, water use, et cetera. And they're just staring us in the face. We have lots of opportunities. Borrowing techniques of industrial agriculture and organic agriculture, blending them together, we have some really great solutions out there, but we've got to make sure they happen. We also, though, have to really think not only about supplying the world with more food, why don't we think about what we already have and how we use it? And this is where I get a lot of interesting email about this one, the diet question, because this is a little uncomfortable for folks, because the elephant in the room turns out to be a cow. This is the American agricultural system here, where the Midwest. I'm from the Midwest. I'm just north of this great thing they call the Corn Belt, the largest extent of agriculture in a single species on Earth. This Corn Belt, if you put all the corn in America together, it's bigger than Montana. That's a pretty extraordinary amount of real estate growing one thing. That isn't food. It's a chemical feedstock to make ethanol and to feed animals. And then that stuff is the food we eat. Well, how efficient is that? Turning corn and soybeans, which we're the only country in the world, by the way, that really does this on a massive scale. Okay? Most of the rest of the world is doing grass-fed operations mostly. But in the US, we turn our primary agricultural products into milk, eggs, poultry, pork, beef, and this is the efficiency of doing that for calories and for protein. Animals don't make protein, they convert protein from plant to animal protein. They're not alchemists, they just convert stuff. So here, look at the cow. 3% efficiency for calories. So if you have a boneless steak, a filet mignon in your table, let's say it's a big pound steak that you and your partner are going to share. It takes 33 pounds of corn to make that in the United States on average. The Beef Council will tell you it's 8 pounds. They're lying because they're including the hoofs, the rawhide, the rest of the stuff, the guts, everything. Maybe you can have some haggis along the way, I don't know. But, not for steak folks. It's 3% efficiency to make muscle from corn and soybeans in terms of feedlot beef operations. This is a really insanely inefficient process. So if you want to lose 97% of your calories in a food system, this is a good way to do it. So we have to really think hard about that, especially because there are two worlds in agriculture. There's a world that's shown in green where people feed people. So China, India, Africa, the Mediterranean, like Italy, Portugal, Turkey, places with really great food. The crops they grow are fed directly to people. This is showing of all the agricultural production in the world, what's fed to humans directly. Wheat, rice, vegetables, fruits, grains, things like that. But you go to the Midwest, in Minnesota where I live, it's only about 15% of all the agricultural production is actually fed to people. The other 85% either go to ethanol or to animals, which we do eat, but with about an average of 10% efficiency of conversion, depending what kind of animal product it is. So it turns out in the Midwest, and I get a lot of angry mail over this because I live there, turns out that the average Iowa farmer feeds fewer people per acre than the average farm in Bangladesh. He grows 10 times more of it, but 90% of it is lost through inefficiency or diversion. So if you want to feed the world, we can mine those red areas and say, you know what, maybe a little more chicken and a little less beef, or maybe rethink the ethanol thing a little bit, because there's lots of food just waiting to be produced there, but we're sending it someplace else. You can't think about feeding the world without confronting this reality. Only 60% of what we grow is actually directed to the human diet, 35% to animals, 5% to biofuels. And on top of that, even if you want to keep your steaks and all that, which is, I still eat beef, just a lot less of it than I used to. But on top of all that, we waste, in addition to that dietary change, in addition to that, there's another 30 to 40% of the food in the world that is lost post-harvest. In rich countries like ours, it's often at the consumer end of the spectrum. In poor countries, it's often lost at the beginning of the supply chain between the farmer and the market. It rots, it isn't transported right, it doesn't get to the market, and it's an economic and food security failure. So we got some big problems here. But the key lesson here is that, guess what? There's actually good news here. Between all of those 5 steps I outlined, we can actually pretty easily, if we did those 5 things, we can feed the world and at the same time dramatically reduce CO2 emissions, biodiversity loss, phosphorus and nitrogen pollution, and unsustainable water withdrawals. In fact, we could almost eliminate those and still double the nutrition available to the planet. Physics and biology part of that work. The problem is people. What we're doing everything the other way. We're going precisely the wrong direction. But the point here is that sustainability is in fact possible. Solutions do exist, whether it's climate change, whether it's this great challenge of food security in the environment, even these mind-boggling global problems. Guess what? If you look hard, the solutions exist. But they're going to require some really different ways of thinking. It's not that it's impossible, it's just we have to think very differently than we ever have before. Because again, human history, we could always go somewhere new to get resources or to pollute and move on, but now we can't. We're done with that. We went from an empty world to a full world. And living in a full world requires different kinds of rules. One of the rules we have to think about very hard, though, is about our stuff. We love our stuff. Our current consumer culture, kind of a Western consumer culture, we love stuff. And when I talk to my students over the years, I say, what is it that you love the most? And tell me about all these things. I had one student quote Charlton Heston once by saying, "You can take my iPhone out of my cold, dead hands." And I'm like, okay, that's weird, but okay. But we love our stuff, and we all do. We're kind of stuff addicts, and some of this stuff's pretty cool. But I'll tell my students, okay, great, take your iPhone, your camera, your car, whatever. You love that so much, let's put it in a safe and lock it up and make sure that it's safe and secure. How do you like it now? And they look at me like I'm a complete idiot and say, well, I can't play my music inside a safe, dude. And I'm like, well, right, because it isn't the stuff that mattered in the first place, it was the service it actually provided you, right? Yeah, I guess so. Well, hey, look at what we've done in society. We used to have other things produce our services, like heating water, taking showers, lighting our rooms, playing music, dealing with sanitation, getting around. These are the tools of about 30 to 50 years ago. Look at the counterparts today. much more efficient lighting, high efficiency water, better toilets. The jukebox to the iPod is a mind-boggling transition. Water heaters, hybrid cars that provide even better services than before with far less energy, far less materials, and far less waste. Well, if we think we're clever so far, let's talk to our friend the pond scum, because he's even smarter over here. Nature has no waste. It doesn't exist. Nature has waste in one part of an ecosystem is simply food for another part of it. In the typical forest, you can reuse a single phosphorus atom about 50 times and then put it back in the soil gently, never creating any waste at all. So if we look at biological systems as kind of models for our industrial economy, we can see 10, 100-fold, million-fold improvements of material efficiency while still providing the same services of a modern Western society. So, decoupling development of the economy and of our quality of life from growth of consumption of stuff, we can really do better. We don't have to give up economic development at all. In fact, in order to save the environment, I think we have to accelerate it. But we can decouple it from the growth of consuming material and energy and producing waste. It's called being smarter. And if we can be as smart as the pond scum, we'll be in shape. They've just had a couple billion years head start on us, that's all. So we got a lot of room here. We also have to rethink the economy completely, because it isn't that the economy is bad or markets are bad or any of that. Markets are fantastic ways of solving problems if they're sent the right signals. But the problem is the market doesn't get the signal that helping these people is important. Helping the billion people who are food insecure, who might not have clean potable water, or who suffer from routine diseases, that's not valuable according to our economy. That's insane. Or that this, our planet, isn't valuable. There's no ledger sheet anywhere that accounts for this. And yet markets actually are very good at, when they get the right signals, are very good at figuring out how to solve problems. So how do we do this? How do we put a dollar figure on nature? Well, you can. This idea, which I know Margaret will talk about tomorrow more, of ecosystem goods and services, that, hey, nature does a lot for us. And she doesn't get paid for that. But maybe we ought to be thinking about that in our accounting schemes. The fact that nature provides all of our water, all of our breathable air, our watershed protection, our carbon sequestration, our pollinating insects, mitigating infectious disease, and so on. And if you think this is some wacky left-wing idea, I'll tell you that this image came out of The Economist. Not exactly, the Utne Reader or Mother Jones. I mean, this is pretty serious stuff. And even though Rio plus 20 seemed like a disaster, if you looked at what the national governments and political structures did, the Fortune 500 actually did a lot there. You saw major corporations around the world said, we will start to include principles of natural capital into our internal pricing signals. So companies even like Dow Chemical and Cargill and Deutsche Bank and HSBC signed commitments saying, we are going to have pricing of nature in our internal decision making. No government told them to do that, but they're starting to do it anyway. It's a fantastic step in maybe the right direction. Having capitalism work with the environment instead of against it. Maybe that's something we could build on. One other thing we have to think differently about is not only our stuff, how we think about the economy, we have this incredible opportunity to think about how we collaborate. You remember the old bumper stickers that think globally, act locally? Throw that away, please. It's just the opposite. Think locally and network globally. If we only solve our local problems, we're doomed. But if we have local innovation here in Provo and somebody in Portland and somebody in, Poland or whatever, a lot of P words here, if we put all those together and share what we know in a global context, we might have enough time to pull this off. But if we're only going to work locally, we'll never get there. We need local innovations and experimentation scaled to the globe, like right now. We have to do that. And guess what? Fortunately, we have tools to do that right now, like the internet. This is a mathematical map of what the internet looks like if you were to kind of draw it in terms of its traffic flow. It looks like a weird abstract art painting. But it isn't, because there's structure to it. It turns out that if the internet were just random, like you have a web page and your web page has 100 links on it, and then it goes to you, and you have 100 links, and then another 100. If that were random, this would be just a uniform gray cloud. But it's not, because that's Google. Everybody's just one step away from Google. This map's kind of old because this shows that's Facebook and that's MySpace. Remember that thing? Yeah. A more up-to-date map would have Facebook. Facebook has over 1 billion people using it today. 1 billion. The third most populous nation on Earth is Facebook. Okay, that's kind of scary, but this is all porn up here, I think. I don't know. I mean, this is crazy, but we're using these tools for shopping and dating and playing Farmville. I mean, how many people are playing Farmville on the internet, but we're not using it to teach people how to farm? Why don't we do that? Well, there are some incredible innovations that have already started to happen, but we could do so much more. The Wikipedia experiment. Well, people kind of pick fun at Wikipedia, but it's actually more accurate than any other encyclopedia, and it's self-correcting. It's pretty amazing, and it was done for free. That's astonishing. Or Google, using real-time techniques to track the spread of avian influenza or H1N1. All of these incredible challenges we can do instantaneously, rather than requiring a paper record to go to the World Health Organization, taking months to get approved, and coming back. This happens in seconds. When a public health worker with a smartphone says, I have a suspected case of swine flu here, click, everybody in the world knows about it. Amazing opportunities for transparency, collaboration. We have a project we call the Earth Collaboratory, which is to build a platform that brings Google technology with Wikipedia, with Facebook, kind of social marketing, social networking tools to focus on major sustainability challenges. There are incredible opportunities if we stop just using this for LOL and following Kim Kardashian, So we could use these tools, and they're here just in time, thank goodness. Well, we also have to think, and this will be one of my last points, we have to think a lot better about our strategies too, because environmentalists, we tend to get stuck. We get stuck on symbolic, kind of meaningless issues that aren't really up to the scale of solving our global challenges. We have lots of feel-good stories, but they're basically because we have two narratives. We have a narrative in the environmental community that's one is change your light bulb and everything will be okay. Sorry, it won't be. Changing one of these light bulbs is not even a drop in the bucket. Please do that. But it's not really enough. We'll have to do a lot more than that. But the other narrative is it's going to be gloom and doom, the apocalypse. We're done, it's all over. Well, somewhere between the light bulb and the apocalypse, there's a lot of work to do. And it's to require really strategic thinking about large-scale systems. So if you want to do that, figure out where they are. How do you influence a large system? Well, instead of getting stuck, we can go back and remember Archimedes. Archimedes said once, if you want to, give me a place to stand and a lever, and from which that I can move the world. He was right, because there are such things as planet levers. There are places where if you focus your attention, you can get a lot of bang for your buck. For example, on climate change. Forget the XL pipeline. That's such a non-issue for climate change. It's ridiculous. It's like less than 1% of North America's energy economy, even if it were ever built. You want to actually solve climate change, go for the big guns. Here, 2 countries, Brazil and Indonesia, with just 5 crops, beef, soybeans, palm oil, sugarcane, and timber, I can get you 15% less CO2 emissions on the planet. That's more than all the cars, trucks, airplanes, and everything transportation in the world combined. 2 countries, 5 crops. Most of that's already happening in Brazil. Brazil's deforestation rates have dropped by 80% in the last 5 years. Focus, focus, focus. That's a planet lever. There's another one on nitrous oxide. There's another on methane. There are solutions here where 80% of the problem usually exists in only 20% of the system. If you know where to look, you can find leverage points. Don't worry about political symbols. Look for the physics and find out where the biggest lever for your effort can be. And they're out there, but we never hear about them, and we have to. Well, I mainly talked about kind of the science and kind of technology issues here, but this is kind of a symposium about ethics and connecting sustainability to stewardship. I'm not going to pretend to be somebody who can talk about ethics in any kind of professional sense, but I'd like to just share a few thoughts about that as a scientist and then open it up for discussion. If you go back to the starting premise I had at the beginning, was that we live in this inflection point. I strenuously argue that this is true. Every generation in history thinks they live in the most important time in history, but for us it's actually true. Really. I'm not making that up. It sounds like, but we really do. And whether we like it or not, what we do now is going to influence not only our generation and the next, it will influence all future civilizations that come after us for tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of years. in terms of biodiversity, the climate system of our planet, the ocean acidification issues, the nitrogen cycle, et cetera. These are things that will be geologic in scope. And so whether you like it or not, you were born in that moment in history that has to make a decision. And it's a really important decision between, well, the people we usually are, pretty selfish, self-centered, easily distracted, petty, partisan idiots mostly, versus the people we could be, the very best of us. We know what this is supposed to be. All of us know what this is. It's like the people who, went through the Depression and fought the World War II and came back and built a great country here. It's people who go on missions around the world, asking nothing in return, only to serve the fellow humanity. That's incredible. We know, we have examples of the best people we can be. If we were all like that, we'd be in very good shape. A choice between the world we accept and the world we know that should be is, again, a choice. And fortunately, we still have time to make that choice. And there are a lot of reasons for optimism. I think a lot of environmental folks, we get very gloomy. We tend to be, environmentalists never get invited to parties. Or never more than once, anyway. And that's because we're just so depressing to be around, but you don't have to be. I'm actually incredibly optimistic about the future. We have the biggest challenges in history, but we also have the most incredible tools in history. And if anything we've learned from history is that when we are presented with great challenges, we often rise to those occasions and become incredible. We become great. And we know that this is true because everything we always thought was impossible suddenly becomes possible. Think about our recent history. I was born in the late 60s, and through almost all my youth, we all knew that the world would end in a nuclear apocalypse, a World War III between the Soviets and the United States. It was just built into the discourse. We knew that was going to happen, and there's no way to avoid it. Then suddenly it wasn't true anymore. We also knew that things like segregation and all this kind of thing could never be overcome. And look what Barack Obama just won a second term. This is kind of incredible. Martin Luther King that dream came a lot earlier than he could ever have imagined. Or apartheid ended peacefully. Who would have thought that? All of these things were impossible, yet they happened. Or the collapse of the Soviet Empire and the end of the Cold War. These were all impossible things, and yet they all happened. So don't tell me something's impossible, because that just tells me, yep, that's going to happen. Almost always what we call impossible in history becomes the next stage of our history. And guess what? It isn't just up to us. We do live in that inflection point, but we have some partners along the way. They're just not here yet, because we have to build partnerships with the future. Now, those of you who are older, who are parents or grandparents, you understand this intergenerational compact we make with our kids and our grandkids. But those of you who are students, at least my students, they're kind of glaze over like, don't tell me about future generations. I'm the future generation right now. So I like to show them this little picture here. So look, you're going to have to work with the future, and guess what? This is the future. There could be people from Sydney, Santiago, Rio, Amsterdam, Hong Kong, and most of my students will usually ask me like, hey, can I get her phone number, or can I text her? These people are gorgeous. They're like supermodels, right? The problem is, the trick here is none of these people actually exist. This is a project called The Face of Tomorrow. It's an artist who goes around with a digital camera to all the cities of the world like this, and he takes pictures of just ordinary people on the street. And he goes back to his studio, and with some software, he stitches all those faces together, and he looks for the emergent face of the crowd. So this literally is what the future of humanity will look like eventually. Unfortunately, apparently the future is going to be incredibly good looking. That's at least one cause for hope in the future. But I don't know why, but for me, these are my clients. These are your clients. These are the people we're working for and with. Because our transition to sustainability will take centuries, but only if we start. Otherwise, they won't even have a chance to begin. So we have all of this, but finally, in terms of an ethical consideration, and this is my last point, the most powerful thing we have of all isn't optimism, but hope. Those are different things. And Barbara Kingsolver once wrote, not about sustainability, but it's so applicable, I want to use it here. She wrote once in a book called Animal Dreams, she said once, the very least you can do in your life is figure out what you hope for. What I want is so simple I almost can't say it. Elementary kindness. Enough to eat. enough to go around, and the possibility that kids might one day grow up to be neither the destroyers nor the destroyed. And that's about it. So with that, I'd like to leave you with a little bit of hope and a tremendous thank you for your time and attention tonight. Thank you very much.